Hi, my name is Nina, and the paper I'm presenting today is titled Mirror Ritual, an Affective Interface for Emotional Self-Reflection. And this research was done at SensiLab, Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. So firstly, I'm going to go into the history of affective computing and how it has evolved alongside our understanding of human emotion, before I introduce our novel affective interface, Mirror Ritual, and discuss some of the findings from the study. So affective computing describes the development of computational systems that can recognize, simulate, or express emotion. Originally proposed by Rosalind Picard to streamline interactions between human and computer. Currently, a majority of emotion recognition techniques involve combining one or more input modes, so heart rate, body language, or facial expression, to determine someone's emotional state. And with the recent success of computer vision in image classification tasks, we're seeing a lot of neural nets being used to predict someone's emotion according just to their facial expression. But many of these approaches are built on a lot of underlying assumptions about emotion. Firstly, emotions are universal across cultures, and also that emotion categories such as happiness, fear, and sadness have some kind of unique fingerprint that make them distinguishable from other emotions. These then imply that the emotion categories are hardwired into our brains and our bodies. But over the past 2 decades, there has been a lot of neuroscience research done trying to identify these particular areas or circuits in the brain that correspond to these emotion categories. In particular, there was a meta-analysis done on neuroimaging studies of emotion that revealed that there aren't any dedicated areas or circuits. But of course, these findings conflict with our experience of instances of basic emotion in everyday life. And for this reason, basic emotion theory has remained pervasive in both research and in greater society. The neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett created the theory of constructed emotion, which seeks to solve this paradox. The theory states that basic emotions aren't innate or hardwired, but they're built from more basic psychological processes. So these include core affect, so valence or arousal, concepts, which you gather through experience, usually supported by language, and the agreed upon social reality, which are the agreed upon concepts within a culture that allow us to communicate ideas. Your brain basically makes predictions about how you're feeling on the fly with the goal to maintain allostasis. It's a really incredibly interesting theory with a lot of implications for how we deal with and regulate our emotions. But there are also many implications for emotion recognition and affective computing more broadly. It questions whether it's even feasible to build systems that are transferable across cultures, contexts, or even across individuals. Furthermore, it fundamentally disagrees with the idea of accuracy in emotion recognition. If we think about emotion perception in humans, there is no concept of accuracy anymore. As my brain is making a prediction, just as your brain is, there is no objective benchmark to compare against. So instead of accuracy, Barrett suggests we strive for synchrony in an interaction. And that's just an agreement on our predictions. So building on this idea, co-construction is then the iterative process of making predictions and testing them out within an interaction to achieve synchrony, whereby this process actually shapes emotion experience itself. So these issues have already been acknowledged in affective computing and HCI research with the interactional approach. So the idea is to treat emotion not as a piece of information, but something that exists only within an interaction. Usually this approach uses the machine as the mediator of emotional communication between humans, or as a tool to track and organize emotional experiences and present them for reflection. But almost all of these approaches avoid implementing an emotional model completely in fear of reductionism. So what we aim to do with Mirror Ritual is create an effective interface that does make use of explicit emotional models, but not in any attempt to accurately measure a user's emotion, but to leverage the machine perception of emotion in order to engage users in the co-construction of their emotional state, with the ultimate goal of promoting emotional reflection and regulation. So now I'm going to talk about the design of the mirror. So here's the schematic. We have a monitor and a webcam concealed behind mirrored glass, held together by a wooden frame. And once the mirror is activated when a person approaches and looks into their reflection. And once their face is detected, their current emotion is estimated based on facial expression. And this detected emotion is used to generate a unique poem. So here's a flowchart of the system architecture. The video camera captures a real-time stream that is sent to a face detection algorithm. Once the face is detected, the interface performs classification using a CNN trained on images of human annotated facial expressions classified into 7 categories: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and neutral. The prediction and the associated probability of that prediction is then mapped to an emotion word, which is used as input to the text generation model. For our text generation model, we used the GPT-2, which was fine-tuned on a custom corpus of texts. And here you can see how we use the emotion prediction to generate a phrase, which is then used as a prompt for the text generation model. The style of poetry generated is determined by the training corpus, for which we combined a number of different writing styles, such as horoscopes and postmodern poetry. And we deliberately combined poetry with more informal writing in order to generate output that's still accessible while remaining abstract and open to interpretation. So here's the first iteration of our interface. And this interface was designed with sustained engagement in mind. So users are meant to incorporate the mirror into their daily routine, developing a relationship with the device over periods of weeks, months, or even years. And for this reason, Mirror Ritual has been designed to assimilate easily into daily life. So it looks just like a regular mirror. It could be installed in a bathroom, living room, or a hallway to be used in those transitional moments of your day. So in order to evaluate this interface, we adopted a framework for the quality of meaning in HCI, which was originally developed by Meckler and Hornbeck and presented at CHI last year. The framework outlines the 5 components of meaning to be connectedness, coherence, resonance, purpose, and significance. We use these 5 components as a basis to determine whether participants can emotionally engage with the mirror in a meaningful way. So in the study, we recruited 15 participants to use the mirror regularly over the period of 1 week. And at the end of the study, participants completed a self-assessment questionnaire along with a semi-structured interview regarding their impressions of the mirror. And the questionnaire was developed to evaluate individual responses to each of those 5 components of meaning. So it consists of 15 questions, 3 for each component, with responses recorded on a Likert scale. And in this preliminary stage of research, we chose to approach the evaluation with both quantitative and qualitative methodologies, but we found in the end that the qualitative findings were the most insightful and the most constructive for this research. And so here are the results of the questionnaire. The box and whisker chart shows distribution of answers to the self-reported survey questions. Vertical black lines are the mean for each question. And overall, the most positive responses with the highest average relate to significance and connectedness. There was a medium correlation between most questions in their categories. And as there is no standardized testing for Meckler and Hornbeck's framework, this is really just the first attempt at trying to quantitatively evaluate meaning when using a designed device in HCI. So now I'll briefly discuss the results of the interviews and split into the 5 components of meaning. Firstly, we found that many participants developed a connection directly to the mirror, but the mirror also allowed participants to draw connections to themselves and to the outside world. And perhaps the most interesting finding here was that around 60% of participants were compelled to take a photo selfie with the mirror to either keep for themselves or to share with other people. And although it was designed for kind of private use, the mirror's poetry was often used to actually communicate emotions to other people. And coherence, coherence describes a user's ability to make sense of an experience. And this is particularly interesting when we're talking about machine-generated poetry. So we found that participants naturally engage in the sense-making process, with some finding it challenging and confusing at times, usually when the presented poem was too long and became nonsensical. But a number of participants found that the sense-making process to be actually one of the most rewarding aspects of their experience. So in this image here, the participant had talked about having a difficult day where a student confided in them about something traumatic that had happened to them. And then when they reflected on this poem, they felt that it accurately represented how they were feeling about that situation. They're able to make sense of the poetry. And so resonance is different to coherence in that it doesn't require active reflection, but it describes the visceral feeling triggered by the experience. We found that the best examples of resonance were when the mirror caused an unexpected surprise or it triggered an instant emotional response. In this example here, 2 participants were sitting around the mirror having a conversation about love and attachment. This poem suddenly appeared, which caused the participants to interrupt the conversation to talk about how weirdly coincidental it was. And here's another example of resonance. So this participant had a long, grueling day of work, and on their commute bike ride home, they fell off their bike. And after feeling quite defeated the next morning, they reported that this message from the mirror brought them to tears. So strong emotional reactions like this happened only once, if at all, for participants. But it was these interactions that left the biggest impression on them, we found. So participants weren't given any particular task or goal in the interaction, so their reasons for using the mirror were left for them to discover. About half of the participants just used it out of curiosity. A third of participants used it to create a moment for themselves to reflect and become mindful of their emotions. And around 20% of participants failed to find any compelling reason to visit the mirror. And we found that this was likely due to a lack of continuity across visits, which left participants feeling as if their interactions were disjointed. And significance turned out to be the most difficult component to design for. So how do we create lasting value for users? A follow-up interview with participants was conducted to investigate their lasting impressions of the mirror, and we found that 60% had taken a photo with the mirror that they had revisited later, although only a handful of participants talked about how the mirror's poetry actually impacted on their life. But overall, we found that a majority of participants, about 70%, were able to emotionally engage with the mirror, and that the open-ended nature of the poetry allowed participants to kind of fill the gaps and find their own meaning in the mirror's messages. And at times, it's almost like the poetry allowed participants to conceptualize and in some cases even verbalize what they have been feeling. Also, through our evaluation, we identified a number of design improvements for the next iteration of Mirror Ritual. Most importantly, we found that users need some kind of continuity between interactions in order to develop a real purpose for the mirror and to benefit from using it in day-to-day life. Through this study, we also discovered that the documentation of interactions with the mirror is actually incredibly enlightening, and it shows the range and the nuance of emotional experiences generated. So in the future, we plan to document these experiences in some form, even through tangible objects. And here is a little preview of the new iteration of the mirror that we are currently developing and planning to exhibit now to a broader audience. In the mirror, we're using existing emotion classification techniques, but it's not in an attempt to actually measure or accurately predict somebody's emotion. Instead, it's meant to provide prompts and kind of conceptualizations that allow the viewers to reflect and be introspective about their emotion. And in that way, what I hope to do is create this kind of co-construction between human and machine, co-construction of emotion. So when we first developed the mirror, we ran a few preliminary studies into how people engage with it. I think the most interesting thing for me that I found was the way that people interpreted the poetry and how they actually applied that into their own life. And to me, that was kind of an example of how we actually need the viewer to kind of bring that poem alive when you have AI-generated poetry. But in Mirror Ritual, it's meant to be a critique on, the current existing emotion classification technology that's being implemented everywhere. According to the newest science that we have today, it's not actually particularly feasible to read emotion just from looking at somebody or measuring, biofeedback. So I guess I want people to use the mirror and think about those ideas as well. We're currently in the development process of the new iteration of the design, and with this new design we're hoping to just keep testing it and iterating it and seeing how people use it in the future. I think definitely where I started with this work was how do we do co-creation between human and machine. The mirror ended up being a good example of that, where the mirror presents a generated poem, but only with the viewer's kind of emotional input, but also that their interpretation of that poem. That's how it actually becomes a fully fledged poem. That's how I see it. Thanks.